Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor with the Mises Institute. And today we are going to cover the first 100 days of the Trump administration. I've noticed a few headlines to this effect for that people are cranking out now. How shall we evaluate the first 100 days? At some point, I think it was during the FDR days, we decided that the first 100 days is the benchmark for presidencies. So we've got this convention. So we're going to do an episode about it now. Fortunately for me, one of our scholars, one of our guys who we like to go to and who has been involved with the Mises Institute for a number of years is Christopher Calton. Now, Chris is a historian now who works for the Independent Institute. And so I like to go to him for some more historical topic, for some real detailed policy work as well. He's done a couple episodes recently on housing. And now we've got him back. And we're going to talk about the first 100 days because he did an article recently called Assessing President Trump's Second First 100 Days. And that's for the Independent Institute. You can find that at independent.org. Now, so, Chris, I'm just going to kick it over to you in a minute, though. And we're just going to cover a few different topics on, hey, let's look at foreign policy. Let's look at tariffs. Let's look at some of the political issues related to this administration. So we're just going to go through this bit by bit. So the first thing on here is this issue of executive orders. So let's talk about his executive orders a little bit. So, Chris, what do we need to know about Trump's executive orders?
He's passing a lot of them. He is signing I think it was as of Monday, 140 executive orders. It's just wildly beyond anything we've seen from, I think, anybody since FDR. FDR used a lot of executive orders. There's some similarities there that might be concerning to people that don't like big government, as they're both passing a flurry of legislation, and they do so through executive orders. It doesn't mean all the orders are bad. Some of them have been good, some of them bad, and some of them have been stupid. But there's a lot of them. And if you're worried about a large executive, like a powerful executive branch, as I am, that alone should be cause for concern.
I think one thing that distinguishes this administration from the FDR days, and I do think that's a reasonable comparison when we're looking at doing a lot of governance by executive order. I mean, one of the worst executive orders FDR did, of course, was the gold confiscation.
Oh, absolutely.
Executive, right? I mean, it just made up this new presidential power out of nowhere, issues the executive order, people start having to turn in their gold. Terrible,
and it was in
terrible
place till the 80s.
Oh, yeah. But the one thing about that sort of executive order, though, is that it was later confirmed by new legislation. Right, FDR's ruling coalition was far broader and more entrenched than is Trump's. And I think this is one thing that we could point to also when people start talking about how Trump won a landslide victory, and this really confirms how much people really wanted to overturn the old status quo of the Obama-Biden years and stuff. Well, you can't compare it to FDR in that case, because so many of these executive orders, they never eventually were turned into actual legislation passed by Congress. And I think that's FDR also behind him had huge congressional majorities and had no problem. When he was threatening, for example, to pack the Supreme Court, he had the political means to do it.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know. There's only two presidents who, in the midterm of their first term, their party in power actually gained congressional seats, and FDR was one of them. George W. Bush was the other one after 9/11. So FDR is one of only two presidents to actually gain a larger majority in his midterm elections. So he had sweeping congressional support that Trump doesn't have.
So one underlying fact, I think, about all of these executive orders is they don't have like a larger political movement behind them, at least a larger political majority behind them. So I think you could see a lot of this stuff just be instantly overturned by the next administration. And of course, now Trump didn't invent this idea, but we've had a growing precedent of, I'm president now, so I'm going to issue dozens and dozens of executive order and really just rule. It's a now executive state with Congress playing basically a minor role. And so really who does get to be the next president is going to have many choices in just immediately overturning a lot of the stuff because Congress hasn't done anything with it.
And I think this is an important point in understanding the Trump phenomenon. I was thinking about this a lot during the campaign when Biden was still running. Is under Biden, Biden was more than anybody else the puppet president, right? Like he had dementia. They were trying to cover it up. Like he was not the one making the shots or calling the shots on anything while he was president. So Democrats were very much the party of the institution of government. It was everything was institutionalized. Trump kind of is the contrast to it, and this is one of the appeals to him. One of the things that helped him get elected is people get so sick of the machine, which they saw in full view during the Biden administration. It was the machine working, and Trump is the counter to that. He's the personality, right? It's kind of like before Martin Van Buren in New York, you had factional politics rather than party politics, and that's kind of what Trump is, right? He's trying to primary Republican Thomas Massie while endorsing Mitch McConnell. It's about loyalty to Trump, not about loyalty to the party anymore. Which is, kind of what the politics were like before the 1820s, essentially. So now you have this personality, but the challenge with the personality is one, if you don't have the right personality in place, the reforms you're going to get aren't necessarily going to make anything better. When we talk about tariffs, that's probably going to be relevant. And two is it's very easy to undo, right? If you're not reforming the institutions, then everything that's done under the personality is fleeting. So even if it's good, it's probably not going to last when he goes about reform in the way that he is.
Well, let's move on to the tariff topic. And because, if we're going to talk about Van Buren and the 1830s or something, right? I mean, let's go back to that issue. I talk about people really worked up about this issue, something that really surprises me. When I started working at the Mises Institute back in 2014, 2015, nobody was talking about tariffs. And now, and it's a thankless job to run articles on Mises.org about tariffs, because a lot of the people who claim that they're pro-free market will now come back and complain incessantly if you're against tariffs, which are just taxes. Right. And so we're against tax increases, and people come back and say, oh, you just don't realize how good tax increases are. And so this is just very bizarre that people have just kind of done an about face on this, on taxations. But
I don't know.
I don't know about the general phenomenon of the Trump tariff thing. How should we evaluate this?
Just as an aside, have you seen on Twitter or X? I still just call it Twitter. The Thomas Sowell quotes, the guy who runs this page representing Thomas Sowell, is making all these posts in support of tariffs. And it's like, Thomas Sowell's very against these policies. He came out recently and spoke against them. And they just completely just blocking out any interference with their worldview in this. The people that are just behind
I've seen
Trump's tariffs.
Similar points of view all over the place. I'm seeing stuff on many formerly libertarian-leaning stuff that's now running articles with headlines that straight up say things like protectionism is good. And so, we're in a new world of people inventing entirely new arguments about protectionism. But how's the tariff thing going? We're 100. Clearly it takes time for this stuff to really get an idea of what the blowback's going to be and all that. But how would you describe the tariff situation for this administration now 100 days in?
Well, it's a mess, right? The tariffs, it's hard to know where to start with what's bad about them, right? Like, first off, Trump goes out and imposes these ridiculously high tariffs against countries that are only inhabited by penguins in some cases, right? Like, it was completely reckless. And that's just, obviously tariffs against a country with no humans is not going to harm anything, but it just kind of shows how thoughtless this is. Reciprocal tariffs was the idea that they were claiming this was based on, but there wasn't anything close to reciprocity in this. Australia had no tariffs against us, and they were slapped with significant tariff rates, for instance. So this is a very reckless, haphazard policy to begin with. And, it's just like when we talk about income tax or anything else, like we're against it full stop. We know it always has a negative impact on the economy, but like with income tax, a simple flat rate tariff is simpler, it's more reliable, it doesn't create this chaotic uncertainty in the economy. But instead, what we have, and this is one of the problems with protection tariffs versus revenue tariffs, right? Revenue tariffs are, we're just going to have a flat rate tariff to draw in some federal revenues, like we did when that was just about the only way that the federal government could raise money. Ron Paul advocated replacing the income tax with tariffs under that line of thinking because that was the constitutional setup, right? Now, Ron Paul was not pro-tariff. He just considered that the more constitutional and sensible position relative to the income tax. But protective tariffs means that we're imposing tariffs different on different goods, differently on different countries, right? And then add to this, Trump keeps changing them by the day. So if you're a business owner and you're going to say, okay, well, these protective tariffs, they might, even if I realize that they're bad for the economy overall, that still might incentivize investment into manufacturing. But if 3 days after he imposes these extreme tariffs on China and I'm ready to invest in a factory, now he changes them, then I'm just going to I want to wait and see. Right? Well, I want to wait for stability. And this is the most, to me, the most significant point about Trump's tariffs policy is the erratic changes that he's making to it make it impossible to act. It just freezes up capital because even under a high regulatory or high tax environment where you still have market activity, when you know policy is going to be relatively stable, you know how to act. It might make things more expensive. It might make things more difficult to do. But if you can depend on the policy being relatively stable, you know how to act. Right? But when it's when it changes by the second, you just don't know what to do. So you just wait out the storm. And that's what we're seeing. Capital is just freezing up because of this.
Well, this is related to Robert Higgs's issue of regime uncertainty, right? Where, right, you don't know what's coming next. You don't know what costs will be imposed next. So it's hard to take action. It's hard to plan for the future. That's a problem with price inflation as well as economic calculation just goes right out the window when this sort of thing is going on. Now, I talk to a lot of small business people. I mean, back before I was doing this sort of work, that's what I spent a lot of time doing was people in real estate, people in, the sorts of small businesses that had 100 or fewer employees. And a lot of them, if you kind of talk to them and try to get a sense of what's going on, a lot of them still, they're willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, even with all this chaos that's going on, because they're hoping, well, maybe I'll benefit from some deregulation in other places. And obviously, most of these people think Trump is better than Kamala, right? And so they're not willing to condemn really the Trump people yet. But if you talk to them, they will also tell you that things are insane in terms of prices of goods that they need to make things. That's the thing about so many people who think that they're benefiting from tariffs is they'll say, well, I looked at the stuff that I buy and none of it says made on Canada on it. So therefore, I apparently don't benefit from any trade from Canada. As if stuff that comes in from Canada only shows up as a finished good that says made in Canada.
And this is a really important point, too. I wrote about it in the article as Trump's decision to pass these exorbitant tariffs on China, but then he exempted certain finished goods. And it was like, as much as I'm glad that, you're removing tariffs in any way, like this almost can be worse, right? Because people don't realize how frequently the inputs that go into making a finished product cross borders, right? When you're manufacturing a car, the parts might cross borders between like the United States, Canada, Mexico a dozen times, right? I mean, it's incredible, right? Because one part may be manufactured in one area and then cross the border and be put together into another part and then cross back to Canada to put together into another part because it's all being done by different companies. This is where, iPencil, Leonard Read's famous essay, iPencil, is getting some traction with Trump's tariffs, even from people that are not on like the free market side at all, have been sharing this, like Ivy League economists, right? Suddenly are waking up to the insights of this simple essay. But what that essay does is it shows how just in the manufacturing of a simple like 10-cent item, of a standard number 2 pencil, we're getting products from all over the world, and many of these things we can't produce domestically. Right? And so one of the points I made in the article that I thought was really interesting was Mr. Beast, this YouTuber. I've never watched any of his YouTube videos, but he's the most successful YouTuber of all time. Took some of the hundreds of millions of dollars he's made from YouTube and bought a chocolate company, or started a chocolate company called Feastables. And he made this Twitter statement where he said, with Trump's tariffs, it's actually cheaper for me to move production completely out of the United States. And to a lot of people, I think this would look like, well, Mr. Beast is not a Trump supporter. He seems like a somewhat on the left. I don't know exactly where he stands. But this looks like it could just be anti-Trump rhetoric, except for this is exactly what we see happen. The Lifesavers company, when it was bought out by Kraft in 2002, they moved production from Michigan to Canada to avoid the United States' oldest protective tariff, which is sugar. The protective tariff on sugar is so long-standing and so well entrenched that before the Civil War, South Carolinians were ridiculing Louisiana sugar farmers for supporting that protective tariff in the South that was usually so against protective tariffs. But that sugar tariff is why Lifesavers moved production to Canada, right? So we do see things like that where it just makes sense when you have goods crossing the borders back and forth. Just move all the production to a country that doesn't have all these wild tariffs, and then we only have to pay the tariffs once when we bring the finished product over. And so that's likely what's going to be the outcome, especially when you're putting 100% tariffs on the parts that go into a cell phone, but then exempting the cell phone itself. You're not going to bring cell phone manufacturing in the United States. With that, you're going to drive it away.
Well, and it's interesting, too. A lot of the same people who will tell you that central planning is stupid, right? They'll point out, like, the socialist regimes of the days of yore that, well, yeah, obviously you can't plan from the center economic manufacturing or how much should be produced and where. And that's a terrible policy. And yet trying to say that, we can determine what the tax on imports should be for countries A through F, and it's going to be this amount. But if the goods move here and there, then it's going to be a separate amount. This is just central planning. This is just like the central bank trying to set the interest rate. This is just someone from the center saying this is what policies shall be nationwide. And the system is so complex. And as you note, right, the goods cross borders over and over. And the idea that you can produce something and not have to get foreign goods for it is absurd, because the whole world is producing all sorts of stuff. And if you're a business owner, you need to import probably a number of things. And telling those people, well, you should just buy American, assumes two things. First of all, that it's even available as an American-made product. And secondly, that you could get it at still an economically feasible price, because stuff's going to be more expensive in many cases in America. If you want to rehome stuff, what you should be doing is doing your best to destroy the regulatory state and make it easier to build stuff here. Trying to make it more expensive for a American-based factory to get things it needs, which is what tariffs do, is just a terrible policy. But that seems to be what we're doing. Now, if you could argue that tariffs doesn't have to be central planning. You slap a 10% tariff on all goods, no matter where they're from.
A flat rate revenue tariffs, like I mentioned earlier, like Ron Paul wanted a flat rate revenue tariff to replace the income tax under the constitutional system. A flat rate revenue tariff is comparatively less bad. I would rather have no tariffs. Obviously, I like no taxes. Under any circumstances, lowering taxes is a good thing, but flat rate taxes generally work better, and low rate taxes obviously better than high rate. So rates do matter, and the levels matter. And also, I mentioned earlier the problem of imposing them on different countries, and I want to just add to that point is this is also something that drives production to other countries when you have different tariff rates against different countries. What will happen is production will move to the low tariff rate countries. We saw this. This is also the Lifesavers example. It wasn't just to escape the sugar tariffs. It was also because under the North American Free Trade Agreement, shipping Lifesavers from Canada to the United States was very inexpensive, right? And so this is what happens if we have one country that gives in to Trump's demands and gets zero tariffs, like Vietnam or something like this. Then a lot of goods are still going to come from other countries. They're just going to go through Vietnam. So Vietnam's actually, or whoever else it is, I'm just using that as an example, because Vietnam was one of the early countries who expressed willingness to play ball with Trump. But they're going to get a lot of the benefit from that. Now they're going to be able to get some low, revenues from low tariffs potentially from other countries, and then ship them at no tariffs to the United States. We're still going to be getting Chinese manufactured goods. We're just going to have an unnecessary middleman there. And that's exactly what this, different levels on countries are going to have that effect, where we're just going to have goods shipped through the low tariff countries to us as the middleman. Tariff rates different on different goods is going to drive production of finished products to other countries so that they can only pay the tariff one time, right? And then the erratic change in tariff policy freezes up capital and makes it where businessmen don't know how to invest or where to invest. And so all of this works against the goal of bringing domestic manufacturing back.
Well, let's go on to something we can say some nicer things about Trump and I think he's made some improvements in terms of some political changes, right? One of which is abolishing, for example, the Department of Education. So we could say that's a good thing, right?
I've always said if I could abolish one federal bureaucracy, it would be the Department of Education. Environmental Protection Agency is a close second, but the Department of Education is probably the one, if I were given the power to just abolish one, that would be it. So that is a wonderful move. That is the best thing that's come out of the Trump administration so far.
Yeah, and I don't really have a critique. I mean, you want to abolish the department, go ahead. That lowers its political profile too, right? Even if you move some stuff within the department to other departments, which of course is going to happen, it gets that cabinet level person out of there. It lessens the bureaucracy overall, and just really sends the message that the Department of Education really just isn't that important. I mean, it was invented in the 1970s. Somehow America made it all the way to the 70s without a Department of Education. And I mean, this kind of takes us to the next topic, which is really just the issue of overall federal spending. And I think one of the best things about that is the cuts to USAID, for example, right? We're not talking about large spending, and I think we'll have to talk about the big problem with spending that remains in the Trump administration. But we can start off with talking about some of the good cuts that have happened. And I think the good cuts have been, as with, say, abolishing the Department of Education, abolishing some of these highly political organizations like USAID that essentially are taking out of commission a lot of these highly political operatives, people who were posing as non-political bureaucrats. I mean, obviously, a lot of people running the Department of Education were highly political, people serving a very specific political agenda. We're not interested in the education of children, really. And we could definitely say that about USAID. I mean, this money was going to all these media organizations. Who knows where it was going internationally? I mean, just terrible politically.
Historically, this kind of aid has often propped up dictatorships in Africa in particular, right? Like, we're sending federal aid. I don't know that it all comes through USAID. I'm sure much of it does. That's kind of like the standard today. I don't know how long USAID has been in place, but we've sent federal aid in whatever form to like Julius Nyerere. In Africa, like a brutal Africa dictator, and numerous others, because the idea is we're going to send food to these impoverished people. And so you have all the people on the left are just freaking out. Look at all the people starving because of this. Like, this was a horrible cut. It's going to, destroy people in impoverished nations that are dependent on this food. But the food that's sent to them goes through the regime in power. And if the regime in power is this awful dictator, what we're doing is propping it up. I don't know if it's through USAID that we send food to North Korea, but the federal government does send food to North Korea. And what the North Korean regime does is they actually break it down. It's sent in like sacks that are adorned with like the American flag, if I remember correctly. And what North Korea does is it opens that up and repackages it and just says that it's from North Korea. So this is something that helps sustain the dictatorship there, right? And so foreign aid has that effect. We pitch it as going to poor people, and it does. Some of it does make it to that, but it does so in a way that creates a dependency on these dictatorial regimes that we're supposed to be like, with our foreign policy, we're supposed to be trying to undermine. So wiping out the USAID funding is absolutely a good move. Is it gonna cause chaotic disruption? Yeah, it is. I mean, it's kind of like the analogy we use for the Federal Reserve that applies here is like heroin addiction, right? You start using heroin, you develop a dependency, and when you cut off the supply of heroin, you go into withdrawals. It's painful. It is painful, but it's necessary, and that's the way to think about this. Like, there is going to be some chaos sown from that, the cutting off of US aid, because it is something that people develop dependency around, because when you have that, they don't develop like these like impoverished countries, developing countries, they don't develop their own like system of supplying food when they can get it reliably from the United States. So they focus on other things. So it is going to cause some chaotic disruptions, but it's absolutely necessary to get away from these systems that prop up these horrible, brutal regimes through USAID. So it's a very good change that is not going to be painless, but it is absolutely necessary. So we should be applauding that.
And of course, a lot of that aid wasn't necessarily even going to foreign regimes. It was going to even domestic organizations that were interacting with foreign regimes or they're producing media and that sort of thing. And so basically the U.S. government, the taxpayer, was funding a variety of highly political organizations that were pushing a certain agenda. And taxpayers didn't know they were doing that. And so the political side of that has been really important. But I think what got lost in a lot of that, because Doge and the Trump administration was reporting all of these USAID people they were laying off and how this was going to save huge amounts of money. The reality, of course, is that in terms of fiscal policy, it's pretty irrelevant, right? Like, I'm totally in favor of cutting USAID. Every little department cut is great. Every employee cut is great. However, if you cannot take that and then say, "Oh yeah, we're gonna cut $1 trillion from the federal budget," because that's obviously not going to happen. As you and I both have been pointing out, right? The whole Doge anti-climax thing, where they're like, "Yeah, we're going to cut maybe $1 trillion, maybe $2 trillion from the budget," and then they come back a few weeks later and they're like, "Actually, it's $150 billion." So like 10 to 15% of what they said they were going to cut is they're going to cut, and I'll be surprised if it's even $150 billion. So that's just nothing. That's just irrelevant to overall federal spending when you're looking at trillion-dollar deficits every year. So the USAID thing, the cutting of the Department of Education, those are important, but they're totally separate issues from fiscal policy, and people shouldn't mix those two things.
And that's the way, I mean, this is kind of the same thing that happened in Reagan when Reagan had sky-high deficits, right? Is he did want to cut spending. I believe Reagan's, more than Trump, sincerely did want to cut spending. It's just Republicans always have this problem of, even when they sincerely want to cut spending, they have their babies in the budget. With Reagan, it was the military budget, and that's kind of like been the Republican tradition since. It's true for Trump. Just passed the first $1 trillion Pentagon budget, as if the Pentagon can't even pass an audit, like five audits in a row or something like that, where they can't account for like $1 trillion. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yet we're just increasing their budget. We don't even know where the money's going, right? So this is absolutely ridiculous. But Republicans always have this problem, so they'll cut spending in certain areas, but then they just reapportion that elsewhere in their own pet projects. There's no effort to balance the budget. The last time we had real budget cuts was under the Clinton administration, which Democrats still like to point out, even as they call for more spending and more debt. But even that, it was Ross Perot. It was Ross Perot that did that, right? He brought it to the forefront by costing George H.W. Bush his reelection, because Ross Perot was gaining so much support on just campaigning for a balanced budget, that after the midterms in Clinton, when the Democrats got slaughtered by the Republicans in the midterms, there was finally pressure to balance the budget. But that's what you need, apparently. You need a Democrat president and a Republican Congress, because Republicans are very fiscally responsible when a Democrat's in the presidency. But once a Republican's in the presidency, they just want to spend on their own things, usually the military, which needs massive, massive budget cuts. The military is heavily overfunded, right? But Doge's cuts, I'm glad that they're happening. Like you you said, like, it's not that the cuts are bad, it's that the cuts are pathetic. Right. And that's exactly what they've been. A $2 trillion estimate got downgraded to $150 billion in savings. Right. It's measly. It's nothing. I mean, what's the total federal budget now? Not the deficit, but the
It's
total
like
budget is
6.7 trillion.
yeah,
Yeah.
several trillion dollars, and all we can cut is 150 billion. And so the point that I make in this is Elon Musk's problem and Donald Trump's problem is they think that government, like wasteful government spending, is a subcategory of government spending, right? And they still have that mindset that if something's really, really important, the federal government should fund it. And so they're only defunding the things that are just ridiculously absurd, like some, funding for a trans study in Ethiopia or something like that. Right? Like it's just these ridiculously absurd things. Glad we're cutting those. We shouldn't be spending money on them, but that's not what constitutes, I mean, of course that's wasteful, but all government spending is wasteful. This is what they don't realize. All government spending is wasteful. It's not a subcategory, it's a redundancy, right? And it's because they don't realize that even when the government is spending money on things that we do need, like education with the Department of Education, right? Like, we need education. Nobody's denying that education's valuable. We don't want the federal government handling education because the federal government sucks at it, right? It's wasteful government spending because it's something we need, and the government draws money away from better applications of those revenues when it spends it on these bureaucratic inefficiencies, the corruption that we get from them. So all government spending is wasteful. That's why you want to cut wasteful government spending, you cut spending anywhere and everywhere you can. That's how you reduce waste, right? The government cannot be made efficient. The only efficiency comes from the private sector. So that's what Musk and Trump fail to realize. They think all they need to do is cut the most ridiculous cases of spending and everything will be hunky-dory, and that's not the case.
Well, and as you know, most of the spending is not these little things. It's the major programs. So he's bragging about getting the biggest defense spending total ever. What's probably going to end up being more than $1 trillion. That doesn't even take into account veteran spending, which is this whole other problem. There's tons of fraud there. You can't cut that because it's too politically popular. You're just asking your opponent to say, hey, this guy cut funding for disabled veterans, right? But the Veterans Department is a subsidy to the Defense Department because it allows the Defense Department to basically hand off their spending on personnel to some other department and then claim, hey, we're underfunded. So that's not being addressed. And there's no appetite in the Trump coalition or in the general public for cutting things that really spend the money. Social Security, Medicare. In fact, we got Trump people saying, hands off my Medicare, hands off my Social Security. That by itself is something like, I think the last time I checked, 40% or so of federal spending. So if you're not cutting that, you're not cutting defense, where are you cutting? Heck, a recent poll came out showing that most Trump voters don't even want to cut Medicaid, which is for the lower income people. That's more income connected sort of spending. But even they want that. So when you combine all of that, you're just going to have to keep cutting piddling little programs. And that's not going to eliminate what's going to be this year. Probably we're on track for a $2 trillion deficit as we barrel toward a $40 trillion debt overall. There's just not going to be any fundamental difference there in terms of fiscal policy or in terms of the national debt. So we can't anticipate any big change.
If you want to cut spending, the best way to do it, obviously, is just to abolish these federal bureaucracies and eliminate their budget entirely. But the second best thing to do is, if you want to eliminate like wasteful government spending, if we even treat it that way, is to just cut the budget for every department by a certain threshold, to say a 25% budget reduction for every department and let them handle that. Because a lot of the waste that comes from these departments, and I talk about this all the time, is my first job after high school. I worked for a used computer shop, but mostly what we made money off of was purchasing government surplus, which under Florida law, where I grew up in Florida, under Florida law, they had to, like, government agencies had to sell their surplus to private contractors, basically, rather than selling it directly. So my boss was one of these guys. He had an inn. His cousin worked for the prison system that handled like the processing of the surplus. So he got these contracts where he could get on pennies on the dollar government computers and things like this. And my job was to list it on eBay. And I would go and pick it up sometimes. I would go up to the women's prison there in Florida and pick up this surplus. And what shocked me, I was an 18-year-old kid. I was totally apolitical at this time. And what shocked me was we would get like
brand new computers, like these Dell laptops this is back in the day when dual core was like futuristic, right? So we'd get these like dual core, Dell laptops, top of the line, like $1,500 laptops. They were new in box. They hadn't even been open. They were only a year old, and they had 3-year accidental warranties on them. And they never used. And we would get them for like $50 or something stupid. I don't know what was actually paid for them. We get them for dirt cheap and then resell them in our front of house where we actually had customers come in. We would sell brand new laptops that way. We weren't getting the inventory from Dell. We were getting it from the city government of a town with 6,000 people in it. But this is the mechanism by which waste predominantly occurs is when you have a department with a set budget, they don't want to let any dollar go unspent, because if they do, that extra will be cut in the next year. There's no reward for eliminating wasteful spending. You're actually rewarded for spending the entirety of your budget. And so that's where you just got to do blanket. We're going to cut a certain percentage of your budget no matter what, and you decide how your money's going to be spent. And that would itself increase efficiency, to the degree that's possible with government, because true efficiency is not truly possible. But it would increase efficiency relative to what we have now, because it would force them to do away with some of this extraneous spending. When my wife works for the Parks Department in Florida, she told me one time after a hurricane that FEMA was just gifting them all this unused equipment and supplies that they had. And I pointed out it's the same problem, right? It's like FEMA just had this huge budget. They bought too much stuff, and so they were just gifting it to little departments that then would still have their own budgets left over that they would waste on stuff. So it's just this cascading effect with the federal, state, and local governments as well. And so this is where waste comes from, is you have to have an incentive there for them to not spend money. And the only way to do that in government is just to blanket cut the budget. Don't have a team like DOGE that goes in and does these little surgical cuts like what we have now. You just tell the department, you're losing 25% of your revenue. You got to figure out how to deal with that. And that's what nobody, I guess, has the cojones to do, it seems.
Well, and just as a further illustration of how little appetite there is to control spending, you sit here and I sit here and we talk about cutting the budget, and then you'll get all these people say, well, that's just not realistic. Okay, how about this? How about Trump just says, I'm going to freeze the budget for the duration of my presidency? How about just that? 4 years from now, the federal budget will be the same as it is today. That would be amazing. That would have such huge beneficial effects on the economy, because as the economy continued to grow, federal spending, the federal role in the economy would become less over that 4 years.
Relative to GDP.
Right. That would be incredible. But that's not going to happen. They're not even willing to freeze spending, let alone cut it. So that tells us where we are in terms of what political ideology is and what the interest groups want.
I mean, it's what we see with the patronizing debt ceiling idea, where it's like we have a debt ceiling and then we just raise it every few years, right? It's like, so we don't have one at all, meaningfully, right?
Right.
why even have something that we call a debt ceiling if we're just going to have a bipartisan support of raising it every time we reach it?
Well, and a similar trick is we will cut federal spending by $1 trillion over the next 10 years. Those 10-year plans are meaningless. They mean nothing.
And so, just so people know why that's a useful political tactic, is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is legally obligated to assume that any changes in tax revenues are going to, if you lower or raise the rate of taxation, that it's just going to have the same, proportionate to what we're paying now. Right? So you raise taxes, people are just going to pay that much more taxes. They're not allowed to assume any economic effects that would, detract from the new revenues raised or anything like this. So they have these budgeting tricks. This is how they did Obamacare, by the way. They do these. They have to do a 10-year budget to see how fiscally sound it is. And the claim that Obamacare was self-financing was done by budgeting out 10 years, but not starting it until 5 years in. So you start the taxes 5 years early, and you start the spending, halfway through that decade. So for that 10 years, it's self-finance. It looks self-financing, but we had to do 10 years of taxation to get 5 years of funding. So the next 10 years are not going to be self-financing. But this is legally required that the Congressional Budget Office states its projections this way. And so what you get is a legally mandated inaccurate projection, right? Because there's no way your projections for revenues and expenditures are going to be accurate over that 10-year thing. But by doing that, they can make this claim, and then it's never realized, of course, but it's 10 years later, there's new administration in office, and it's somebody else's problem, and they can just repeat the cycle because we all have goldfish memories.
Well, to wrap up, we should talk about Trump's basically, I guess, his trademark issue, which is immigration. Right. The first time it was the wall, which Mexico was going to pay for. I guess that didn't work out. And so now we're talking about immigration. Now, in this case, Trump did indeed, in the second term, has managed to implement significant more reform in terms of immigration. What I find, and I'm sure that most people, most voters, like even inside and outside the Trump coalition, they're not sorry, in spite of what the Democratic leadership might tell you, they're not sorry to see violent criminals go away, right? They're not sorry to see fewer hotels, luxury hotels filled with people who just arrived and started collecting welfare the next day. So I think some aspects of this policy are extremely popular. What I find interesting about the policy is that it's expanded now as the numbers of total deportees has been rather disappointing because it's just not that easy to wrap people up. But now they've pivoted to talk about immigration now, focusing on things like, well, we've got to deport these legal residents who are students at universities because they said nasty things about a foreign government known as the State of Israel and things like that. So it's kind of morphed into this, well, now we're deporting people who are legally residents of the United States. But I think probably the best part of the policy, though, has just been...
Deported a two-year-old U.S. citizen to Honduras the other day.
Oh,
2 years old.
And
a citizen,
right. That's the thing, is when they're citizens and we're still denying that they have due process, that's a significant problem. However, I think it has helped illustrate, though, when we talk about it in news, just how much money was flowing out to people who were getting free welfare when they arrived in the United States. And I think that's probably the number one good thing that the Trump administration has done, is like, regardless, right, libertarians can't seem to agree on just how much immigration there should be and all this stuff. But can't we all agree, right, that there shouldn't be any subsidies, there shouldn't be any government money for immigrants? And that's probably the number one good thing I see coming out of this administration.
That's the most important point I make. And just to clarify my position, and I know a lot of your audiences will disagree with this because libertarians can't agree on immigration, but I do believe that we should have very, very easy immigration. Like in the 19th century up until 1882, we were basically an open border state, and we had the greatest period of economic growth in world history. And it's not unrelated. It's not entirely because of immigration, but it's not unrelated either, right? The opposition to Chinese immigration in 1882, our first anti-immigration law, was because we didn't want competition for railroad workers. They were making it too cheap to build the railroads. Like that was the complaint. They were making it too cheap to do all these things that required labor that they were bringing in Chinese workers for. But of course, there were benefits to that on the consumer side. But I've always said, the problem with the immigration debate is we act like it's just a matter of open borders versus closed borders, right? But it's not that. It's subsidized immigration versus free immigration. And that's what we've had under Democrat policy for years, is subsidized immigration. We have welfare policies set up specifically to support people who come into this country illegally, and then support their ability to live. And I said, I believe we should let them in. But I don't believe that we should subsidize their existence. You got to come over there and figure out how to earn a living and be productive and pay your own way, just like anybody else. That's the idea, right? And that just eliminating those subsidies, there are problems that follow from our immigration policy. I don't deny that, but many of those problems would wither away if you just stopped subsidizing immigration, where people had to be productive contributors to society. Now, of course, on the crime side, the drug war is also one of the biggest causes for the problems associated with immigration. There are drug gang criminals that come over here because of that, but we wouldn't have this without drug prohibition, of course. So that's a side effect of other federal policy. But even deporting criminals, I don't even favor that, because the problem with deporting criminals is they come back, right? And we see this in these stories, like, oh, we're deporting a criminal. He's already been deported twice. Well, then why why do we keep doing this, right? If we have a violent criminal, like somebody who's a murderer or a rapist in this country, and all we're going to do is send them back to another country, then we're basically putting them in an environment where they can just come back home. Gang members, by the way, they've used deportation policies before Trump. They've used deportation policies to get federally paid for trips back home to visit family. Like, they do this intentionally because all they're going to do is get shipped back home. Let's visit family for a little while, have a nice Christmas, and then I'm just going to come back. So that's the problem. It's just like sending them back so they can come back in is not a good policy. And so that's one of the problems with deportations, even if it was only targeting criminals, right? If people are committing crimes in this country, I think they should be held accountable in this country, right? And that's not what deportation does.
Well, that's related to the issue of trying to do this end run around due process, right? Is that even though if you read the Bill of Rights, it's clear that that the Bill of Rights, even though the Constitution talks about citizens in some places, the Bill of Rights only refers to persons and residents and the people. There is no citizen, non-citizen distinction there, and the Jeffersonians have argued this for years, right? The Bill of Rights applies to everybody, citizen or not, for a variety of reasons. And but it does simplify things if we have determined, some agent has determined this guy's a criminal, so we're just going to deport him. But then that causes those separate problems you want. I don't see why anyone would have a problem with, due process involves putting this person on trial for suspected crimes, and then if convicted, spends 10 years hard time in a maximum security prison. And then, of course, you still have the right to deport the person after they do their time. And that's been practiced in most countries forever, right? You serve your time, and then after you get out, you're deported.
And that would be reasonable, like deporting somebody after a prison sentence for a violent crime or a significant property crime, I think would be reasonable. But the idea of having them serve a 10-year sentence first disincentivizes them from just coming back in. And so that's an important caveat. But what Trump's doing instead is paying, I think it was $5 billion to El Salvador to hold them in their prison system, which, might solve some of that problem of them cycling back in if we can trust El Salvador to do that. But then we deal with these horrible injustices of innocent people getting caught up in that system. Like the guy, they're still saying he was an MS-13 gang member. Trump did an interview, was it yesterday or the day before, where he was talking about, the MS-13 tattoos were on his arm, and then the interviewer pointed out, well, that was Photoshop. That wasn't real. That's been confirmed to have been fake. And Trump said, you're not being very nice. I gave you this wonderful opportunity here, and you're not being very nice about it. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, can we not just stick to like what's true here? An innocent man got deported, right? U.S. citizens are getting deported all without due process. Due process is there to confirm that somebody is guilty of what they're being punished for. When we eliminate that, citizen or no, we're necessarily going to violate our own standards, right? Due process is for us, for our country, as much as it is for the people that we're prosecuting in that respect, right? So throwing out due process is very, very dangerous precedent.
So I think when we look at the issue of immigration, we look at the issue of cutting government agencies, even some spending stuff, around the edges.
And I think we should also, before we cut off, we should talk a little bit about foreign policy as well. Because I think one of Trump's mandates was ending these forever wars and the subsidies to foreign wars. That was, in both elections, that was part of his appeal. And he's failing to fulfill that promise and, in fact, exacerbating conflicts elsewhere.
That's the thing, is talking. Perhaps more so than anything, coming into this administration, I had higher hopes for Trump foreign policy than other areas. Now, I probably shouldn't have because there is no interest group, no group of interest groups more entrenched in Washington than are the foreign policy interest groups, what, say, Mearsheimer calls the Washington blob, right? This isn't just AIPAC, Israeli-oriented interest groups. This is all of these interest groups, Raytheon, all these groups that want constant spending. And Ron Paul had an article this week called "The Empire Strikes Back," right? It's looking at how the Trump administration is already being forced to back off on a lot of this stuff because if there's any place that the Washington swamp does not want to be reined in, it's foreign policy. But I was hoping that Trump was just going to kind of come in and say, hey, let's wrap up all U.S. involvement in Ukraine immediately. But that there is, even if Trump gets what he wants, it's clear that it is not disengagement. He's talking about like this horrible policy. We're going to have this mineral pact with Ukraine, and they're going to give us minerals. That's getting the U.S. involved in Ukraine forever. That's not disengaging from Ukraine. And sure, Trump absolutely 100% more reasonable, I think, than the Biden-Kamala oligarchy, whoever was running things under that. Better there. And sure, Biden never pushed for any sort of ceasefire of any kind in Gaza. And Trump is pretty bad on the issue, but maybe slightly less bad than Biden is my reading. But as you point out in your article, right, between Yemen, Gaza, Ukraine, and then stuff you don't even mention, right? Things like Panama, Greenland, other things that we could pointing to.
Right.
There's not much retrenchment going on in this administration in terms of foreign policy beyond maybe it's marginally better than a Kamala win. But how would you come down on this?
Well, I think the critiques over Trump versus Biden is Democrats have never really been anti-war. That's a myth. Historically, Democrats have been a more pro-war party than Republicans by a wide margin since Reagan, or maybe Nixon, if you want to argue Nixon. It's been roughly equal. The warfare state has been very bipartisan, and Republicans are much more on a large military budget. But Reagan wasn't. Reagan was all for a big military budget, but he wasn't engaging in foreign conflicts the way that modern presidents do, right? It was very, very restrained, right? So it's a very different policy now. But the difference with Trump and Biden is Trump very much was elected both times. The first time he talked about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, Biden did that. Biden did it because of pressure. I don't think that would have happened without Trump. It's kind of like what I was mentioning with Ross Perot in the budget. But Trump let Biden have that. Remember when he was campaigning for re-election in 2020, he was still holding withdrawal from Afghanistan as an re-elect me and this will happen. And what ended up happening is by not re-electing him, it happened, right? And so Trump's presidential mandate has been to end these foreign wars, and he absolutely has not done that, right? In his first term, he sent Tomahawk missiles against Syria. Now he's doing this horrible bombing campaign against Yemen, and historically under Obama, we critiqued Obama for supporting Saudi Arabia's oppressive campaign against Yemen because we didn't want to alienate our ally Saudi Arabia, who helped finance 9/11, for God's sakes, right? So we want to play nice with these certain countries, and so we support these horrible, destructive wars that they wage, and Trump is just furthering this because he wants to maintain this tough guy persona, and that's, I think, probably something to think about when you have somebody with that tough guy persona. Teddy Roosevelt had this, right? These are people that generally are going to favor more foreign intervention, and Trump seems to be trending in that direction, right? He's talked about war with Iran. There's a lot of reasons to be nervous about this. The best you could say is he's trying to end the war in Ukraine, but he's doing it incredibly ineptly. He is not. I think he thinks he can do everything the way he did business deals, and it's like dealing with Putin is not like dealing with a business partner. So he's handling even that very, very poorly, but threatening or already starting, in the case of Yemen, wars elsewhere is not a solution to the welfare state. We've got to pull back, not just shift the conflicts from one area of the globe to another, which is what we're doing now.
If there is anything a leader of Russia is not, it's a Western-style businessman. And so we should disabuse any ideas that that's going to go down that way. But I think we could say that the Trump administration overall, I mean, I personally, I'm glad Trump won. I didn't want to endure the horrors of
price controls,
of just 4 more years of Bidenism, whatever that is. I didn't know who was in charge, and even if Kamala had won, we know she wasn't really going to be in charge, right? I don't know who's going to be pulling the strings under that. And I'm glad Trump won, just for no reason other than to demoralize the left, and really just sent the message that half of America hates this stuff. So that was all great.
His election was a huge victory in the culture wars. And that's important. I think that's the major silver lining to the Trump presidency is it just immediately sent a signal that the American population is not with the radical left on these cultural issues like DEI and some of the stuff on gender now in like women's sports and things like this. Is the culture wars are Republicans are winning the culture war, and Trump's victory is a signal for that. And that's where most of the good policies have been fought in the Trump administration so far, as the cultural side.
And of course, that's the easiest stuff to implement a lot of the time when you come in, is that cultural stuff. And a lot of that really depends on just the larger public and what it demands and what it tolerates. But when you get into the harder stuff, fiscal policy, monetary policy, which we haven't even talked about, there are details about immigration, right? The easy thing was defunding free hotels for immigrants, right? But what about that other stuff that's harder to implement and which starts to really get involved in the daily lives of human beings, many of whom are legal residents and that sort of thing? Then the picture just isn't as rosy. And I mean, I didn't expect Trump to be able to unwind this, but just the overall fiscal reality of huge debt, of the business cycle, of price inflation. Trump didn't cause any of that, but at the same time, Trump's not trying very hard, and he's not making it a priority to deal with that either. And for good reason, right? He's not going to get rewarded politically for trying to cut Social Security or anything like that. That's just going to kill him politically. So why would he do that? I mean, you have to have the public on your side, and the public still very much addicted to the federal gravy train. So, I mean, I can't say that I'm actually surprised one way or the other. I mean, things are kind of going. There's a few bright spots here, but the hard questions, that's not being addressed. So I think we'll just continue to see more of that. You dodged a Kamala-shaped bullet back in 2024, but there's a lot of other bullets coming that Trump, even if he wanted to, wouldn't be able to stop. I think there needs to be major systemic changes that no matter how much his followers think he's a great man and a hero, that he's just not going to be able to do much about it.
No.
Well, thank you for joining me on this episode of Radio Rothbard.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And yeah, go ahead and check out his article at independent.org if you want to see that. And of course, if we've got plenty of similar stuff, I'll have my own version of this analysis at mises.org. And you come to the site, and you can also get daily or weekly updates on this. Just go to the site and go to the top where it says subscribe. Click on that, and you can get regular updates as well. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week with more, so we'll see you next time. One more thing, Radio Rothbard listeners, before you go, I want to mention our Revisionist History of War Conference, and that's coming up on May 15 through 17 at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. And this is going to be an extensive conference on foreign policy, and it's going to be historical topics. It's going to be modern topics. It's going to be covering certain wars. It's going to be covering the relationship between the state and the war. It's going to talk about how wars are necessary for building up state power. I'll be presenting there on the work of Ralph Raico, but we've got lots of our top scholars there as well, Tom DiLorenzo being just one of them. And we've got people who've never presented either at the Mises Institute ever before. If you want to register for that, it's $300 for members, $325 for non-members. You can go now to mises.org/RHW, or you can click on events. Just go to mises.org and click on events.